Years ago, when I was 18, my parents left our home in Springfield, Ohio for a 3-day business trip. They trusted me to take care of the house and look after my 16-year-old brother, Ryan. I was in my senior year of high school, already preparing for college, and felt responsible enough to manage things on my own. My parents reassured us that they would check in regularly and that we could call them anytime if we needed anything. At the time, it felt like an ordinary weekend. I had no idea how much that would change. The first night felt normal. Outside, a snowstorm had begun to pick up, swirling thick flakes through the air and coating the ground in a blanket of white. Ryan and I ordered pizza, curled up on the couch, and watched a few movies. We laughed at the dumbest jokes, made fun of the ridiculous action scenes, and enjoyed having the house to ourselves. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows as the snowfall thickened. Around 11 o'clock, Ryan started looking uneasy. He kept glancing toward the hallway that led to the front door, his eyebrows furrowed like he was hearing something. I could not. "Did you hear that?" he asked suddenly. I paused the movie, listening carefully. The house creaked softly, a result of the old wooden floors settling. Outside, the wind howled even louder, making it difficult to tell if any other sounds were mixed in. "Probably just the wind," I said, shrugging it off. "This storm is crazy tonight." Ryan did not seem convinced, but he nodded and let it go. Still, I noticed how he sat a little straighter, his shoulders tense. I tried to lighten the mood, joking about how our old house had a mind of its own and liked to play tricks on us at night. Eventually, we both got tired and went to bed. I fell asleep quickly, thinking nothing of it. The second day passed without incident. The snowstorm had not let up. The entire neighborhood was buried under a thick layer of white, and the roads were slick with ice. Ryan spent most of the afternoon on the phone with his best friend, discussing their upcoming history project, while I worked on a digital art assignment for school. The eerie feeling from the night before had faded completely. That evening, I sat up in the living room with my laptop to finish some coursework, keeping the local news on in the background. The weather report confirmed that the storm was expected to last through the night, bringing even heavier snowfall and near zero visibility. Around 10 o'clock, Ryan decided to make himself something to eat. He wanted something simple, grilled cheese and tomato soup. I could hear him moving around. In the kitchen, the clanking of pots and pans, the water running as he rinsed a spoon. Everything sounded normal. Then, out of nowhere, he screamed. I jumped up, nearly knocking my laptop off the couch, and sprinted into the kitchen. Ryan was standing against the counter, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. He pointed toward the window above the sink, his hand shaking. "There was a man," he whispered. "Standing right there, he was looking at me." I rushed to the window, my heart pounding. The porch light cast a soft glow over the yard, but all I could see was snow swirling wildly in the air, blanketing the ground in a thick layer. The overgrown bushes by the fence swayed under the weight of the ice, casting shifting shadows. I scanned the area, searching for any movement, any sign that someone had been there. "Are you sure?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Maybe it was a shadow or the way the snow is moving in the wind. Ryan shook his head violently. "No, I saw him. He was staring at me, and he was covered in blood." A chill ran down my spine. I locked the back door and pulled down the window blinds. Ryan was still visibly shaken, his breathing uneven. I placed a hand on his shoulder, trying to reassure him. "We will keep everything locked," I said. "Nobody is getting in." Neither of us had much of an appetite after that, but we forced ourselves to eat. Before heading upstairs, we double-checked all the doors and windows, making sure they were locked. Just to be safe, I stayed in Ryan's room with him until he finally drifted off to sleep. When I returned to my own room, I told myself that whatever he had seen, if he had seen anything at all, was gone. At 3 o'clock in the morning, a loud, urgent knocking shook the front door. The sound was relentless, forceful, almost desperate. My eyes flew open and my entire body froze. My heart pounded so loudly that I could hear it in my ears. The knocking continued, growing more aggressive. It sounded like someone was trying to break in. Outside, the storm raged on, the wind howling like a wounded animal. Snow pelted the windows, making it impossible to see anything beyond the swirling white darkness. I held my breath, listening, trying to gather the courage to move. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. Silence filled the house aside from the muffled roar of the blizzard outside. I stayed in bed, barely breathing. I strained my ears, listening for footsteps, for any sound of movement outside. But there was nothing, only the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs. The rest of the night was eerily quiet. I barely slept. When the sun finally rose, I felt a mixture of exhaustion and curiosity. The snowfall had stopped, leaving everything outside buried under thick, undisturbed layers of white. I needed to see if there were any signs that someone had been outside. I grabbed a bag of trash from the kitchen, using it as an excuse to check the yard. As I walked toward the garbage bins near the side of the house, my eyes caught something unusual near the fence. A figure lay face down in the snow. For a moment, I thought he might be injured. My stomach tightened as I cautiously stepped closer. "Hey," I called out hesitantly. "Are you okay?" No response. As I stood over him, I realized with a sickening certainty that he was not breathing. Blood stained the snow beneath him, a stark contrast against the pure white. His face was turned away from me. I did not recognize him. My hands trembled as I fumbled for my phone and dialed the police. Officer Carter arrived with 2 other officers. They carefully examined the body, their expressions unreadable. They asked Ryan and me a series of questions. Had we heard gunshots? Seen anyone outside? Did we recognize this man? We told them everything. Ryan's sighting, the knocking at the door. The officers exchanged glances, but they did not say much. Finally, one of them spoke. "We will investigate and let you know what we find." We never got a name. No missing person reports matched his description. None of the neighbors had seen anything unusual, and the footprints in the snow, there were none. Winter storms in Norway are nothing new. People here are used to dealing with heavy snow and strong winds, even when the weather turns rough. I have been living alone in my cabin for about 5 years now, a simple place on the edge of the forest, far enough from the nearest town to enjoy the quiet, but close enough to drive in when needed. That night, however, the storm was different. It was harsher, wilder. It was a Saturday in late January 2023. The forecast had warned about a powerful blizzard rolling in, so I closed my shop early, letting my employees go before the roads got too bad. By the time I reached home, the snow was already piling up fast, covering everything in a thick, uneven layer. After shoveling just enough to park my truck, I hurried inside, locked the door, and cranked up the heat. The wind roared outside, rattling the windows now and then, but I had always found that sound comforting. I made a cup of hot coffee and settled into my old recliner, the one that leans too far back if you are not careful, ready for a quiet evening. Just me, the storm, and a good movie. Around midnight, I was halfway through a documentary about Arctic wildlife when I heard it. A knock at the door. I froze, my hand hovering over the remote. Living this far out, visitors in the middle of the night were unheard of. My closest neighbor was nearly a kilometer away, and they had never once shown up unannounced, especially not in the middle of a snowstorm. I stood up, walked over to the window, and carefully pulled the curtain aside to look outside. The snow was still falling heavily, blurring the view under the glow of my porch light. At first I saw nothing, but then my stomach tightened. There were boot prints in the fresh snow. They led straight to my door and then back down the steps. The prints were sharp and fresh, untouched by the falling snow. That meant whoever had been there was standing at my door only moments ago. But where had they gone? Opening the door was not an option. The wind would have blasted snow into the house, and besides, something about those footprints made my skin crawl. My hand hovered over the lock for a few seconds as I listened. Nothing. Just the wind. I locked the door again and went back to my recliner, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. Maybe someone got lost. Maybe it was a hiker caught in the storm. But deep down I knew something felt wrong. An hour later, the second knock came. This time it was not at the front door. It came from the side of the cabin near the kitchen window. I shot up from my chair, my pulse racing. Grabbing the flashlight I kept near the door, I moved toward the kitchen. The window was completely frosted over, making it impossible to see outside. I turned off the lights, hoping to get a better view, then aimed my flashlight through the glass. Nothing. The snow outside that window was untouched. No footprints, no signs of movement. But I had heard it. I was sure of it. I stood there, for a while scanning the yard, waiting for anything to happen. The minutes passed, and eventually, I convinced myself that it had been a branch knocking against the wall, or maybe just my mind playing tricks on me. I locked the windows, turned the lights back on, and went to bed, keeping the flashlight on my nightstand. Then, just as I was falling asleep, the third knock came. This time it was louder. It came from the back of the cabin, near the sliding glass door that led to my deck. My stomach dropped. Sliding out of bed, I grabbed my flashlight and crept down the hallway. I knew the door was locked. I had checked it earlier, but the curtain was open. I stopped a few feet away and peered out. The deck was empty. The snow-covered boards were smooth, untouched. No footprints, no sign of anyone standing there. But the knocks had been real. 3 sharp taps, just like before. I stood there for what felt like forever, staring into the darkness, the only thing visible beyond my yard being the faint outline of the snow-covered trees. The rest of the night was worse. The knocking did not stop. It came every hour, sometimes soft, sometimes loud. Front door, side window, back door. It moved around the cabin, like someone circling it. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps crunching in the snow, but every time I looked outside, there was nothing there. The storm was too fierce to go out, and even if I could, what would I do? Chase after invisible knocks in a blizzard? I spent the night wide awake, flashlight in hand, every light in the cabin on. By morning, the storm had settled. The wind had died down, and pale sunlight seeped through the heavy clouds. Bundling up in my thick coat and boots, I cautiously stepped outside. The yard was quiet, buried under fresh snow. At first glance, it looked untouched. But then, as I walked around the cabin, my heart started to pound. Footprints, they were everywhere. Not just at the front door or the deck. They circled the cabin, weaving between the windows and doors. Whoever had been there had walked the perimeter multiple times, stopping at every entrance, every pane of glass. But the most unsettling part was what I found near the tree line. The footprints continued into the forest, winding between the trees, disappearing into the distance. I followed them. About 200 meters in, the tracks changed. I stopped when I saw them merge with something else. Tire marks. A snowmobile had, flattened the snow curving off into the distance. I crouched down to look closer. The tracks were not fresh. A thin layer of snow had already started to cover them. Whoever had been at my cabin had left just before daylight, knowing the snowfall would cover their tracks. Back at the cabin, I called the police. 2 officers arrived about an hour later. One was young, the other older, clearly someone who had dealt with harsh Norwegian winters for years. They listened as I explained everything. At first they looked skeptical, but when I mentioned the snowmobile tracks, their expressions changed. The younger officer frowned. Could just be kids messing around. The older officer shook his head. Not in the middle of a blizzard. They followed the tracks into the woods but returned within 15 minutes. The snow had already covered them too much to follow. This was not random, the older officer said. Whoever it was, they knew exactly what they were doing. A lump formed in my throat. What do you think they wanted? The officer hesitated. Hard to say. Could have been someone looking for shelter. Or maybe they just wanted to scare you. Scare me? That word did not even come close. That same afternoon I drove into town and bought a gun, because if they ever come back, I will be ready. Working on noisy construction sites all day, surrounded by the constant buzz of power tools and the voices of coworkers, makes you appreciate silence. Building houses with a crew is rewarding, but sometimes you just need a break. That is why I did not think twice about booking a remote cabin in the Lofoten Islands for a long weekend. A quiet, peaceful place far from the city, with nothing but snow-covered mountains and icy fjords around me. It sounded perfect. The forecast predicted a heavy snowstorm, but that only made it more appealing. A warm fire, a cozy cabin, and the sound of snow falling outside. I could not wait. I arrived late in the afternoon just as the first snowflakes began to fall. The driveway had not been cleared in weeks, so I had to park my truck down the road and walk up the winding path with my bags. The cabin looked exactly like the photos. Small, rustic, and surrounded by towering pine trees. The rental company had left the key in a lockbox by the door just as they had promised. As soon as I stepped inside, a wave of cold air hit me. It was colder than I expected. The heater was on, but barely. It must have been set low to save energy. I dropped my bags in the living room, turned on a few lights, and immediately started a fire in the wood stove to warm up the place. That was when I noticed something strange. There were dirty dishes in the sink, a couple of mugs, a plate, and a pan with dried-up grease. I frowned. Maybe the cleaning crew had skipped this place because of the snow. Not a great first impression, but I was not going to let a few unwashed dishes ruin my trip. I rinsed them off quickly and moved on. But then I saw something even stranger. When I walked into the bedroom to unpack, the bed looked wrong. The blankets and sheets were messy, and one of the pillows had a deep impression, like someone had just been lying there. I reached out and pressed my hand against the mattress. It was warm. A chill ran down my spine. I am not the kind of person who gets scared easily, but that was unsettling. I tried to shake it off. Maybe the last guest had left not too long ago. Maybe it was just the heating. I forced myself to ignore it, put my clothes away, and settled in for the night. The evening was peaceful. I made dinner, poured myself a glass of whiskey, and sat by the fire with a book. Outside, the snowstorm grew stronger, covering the forest in white and muffling every sound except the wind. It was exactly what I had hoped for. Around 10 o'clock, I decided to call it a night. The cabin was small, so before heading to bed, I did a quick check of the doors and windows to make sure everything was locked. Satisfied, I got under the blankets, turned off the light, and let the warmth of the fire lull me to sleep. At some point around midnight, I woke up to a noise. At first, I thought it was just the wind rattling the windows or the snow shifting on the roof. But then I heard it, a soft creak like a floorboard groaning under weight. I sat up, my heart pounding. Then, silence. "It is an old cabin," I whispered to myself. "Wood expands, things shift, relax." Still, I grabbed my flashlight from the nightstand and walked through the cabin. Everything was exactly how I had left it. The doors were still locked. The windows were closed tight. The snow outside was untouched. I convinced myself I was overthinking things and went back to bed. When I woke up the next morning, the storm had passed. I brewed a cup of coffee and stepped outside onto the porch, taking in the quiet winter morning. That was when I saw them. Footprints. They started at the back door, clear, distinct boot prints in the fresh snow, leading away from the cabin and into the forest. My stomach dropped. I set my coffee down and walked around to get a better look. The prints were fresh, with crisp edges that had not been covered by snowfall yet. They led straight from my back door into the woods, disappearing between the trees. Then, it hit me. The noises I had heard during the night. Whoever had left those dirty dishes in that warm bed had not left before I arrived. They had been hiding, waiting for the right moment to sneak out. I stood there, staring at the tracks, my mind racing. The creaking floorboard, the strange feeling I had ignored. It had not been the wind or the cabin settling. It had been someone moving. Trying to keep my breathing steady, I went inside and called the rental company. Their response was immediate. Apologies, explanations, and a whole lot of nervous energy. They had no idea someone had been in the cabin. They offered me a full refund and practically begged me to leave immediately. I was not about to cut my trip short. "I will stay the last night," I said firmly. There was a long pause before the person on the phone hesitantly offered some advice. "Doors have heavy manual locks on the inside," they said. "They cannot be opened from the outside. Just make sure you lock them all before you go to bed, okay? That way, even if someone comes back, they will not be able to get in." That was something, at least. After hanging up, I spent the rest of the afternoon securing the place. I checked every door, every window, testing the locks to make sure they worked. The cabin's age worked in my favor. Those solid manual locks could not be picked or tampered with from the outside. By the time I was done, the place felt like a fortress. That night, the wind howled outside and another snowstorm rolled in. But inside, the cabin was silent. I sat by the fire, sipping coffee, replaying everything that had happened over the last 24 hours. Where had they been hiding? The attic? The crawl space? Had they slipped out while I was awake, moving just quietly enough to go unnoticed? I did not sleep much that night. By morning, the footprints in the snow had disappeared under a fresh layer of white. It was as if no one had ever been there. But I knew better, and I would never look at an empty cabin the same way again. Long drives can be exhausting, but sometimes you just want to get home as soon as possible. I had spent a few days visiting my family for the holidays, and instead of splitting the 10-hour drive back home like I did on the way there, I decided to power through in one long stretch. I figured if I stayed focused and took a few breaks along the way, I could make it home before midnight. The first half of the drive was smooth. The roads were clear, the traffic was light, and I had my favorite playlist keeping me company. But about 5 hours in, the weather started to change. Snowflakes drifted down slowly at first, light enough that they barely made a difference. I kept driving, thinking nothing of it. But as the hours passed, the snow got heavier. By the time I was 3 hours from home, it was falling hard, thick flakes covering everything in sight. The road had turned into a slick, icy path, and my headlights barely cut through the swirling snow. The sun had set by then, and with no street lights on this stretch of highway, the only source of light came from my car's beams, reflecting off the endless white around me. There were almost no other cars on the road, which felt both comforting and unsettling. On one hand, I did not have to worry about reckless drivers. On the other hand, if something happened, there was no one around to help. I kept pushing forward. I was still making decent time, and I was determined to get home that night. About 30 minutes after passing through the last town, I saw something up ahead, a pair of headlights, dim and flickering through the thick snowfall. As I got closer, I saw that the car was stuck in the middle of the road. It was sideways, its hazard lights flashing weakly. A man stood outside waving at me. Everything in me told me not to stop. The snow was coming down too hard, the night was too cold, and something about the whole scene made my stomach tighten. But I had no choice. His car was blocking most of the road, and squeezing past him in these conditions was risky. I pulled over, my tires crunching in the thick snow, and rolled my window down just enough to hear him. "My car is stuck in the snow. Can you help me push it out?" he asked. His voice was calm, but his words were slow, like he was not used to speaking English. I hesitated. His car did not look like it was buried too deep. A little push might be all it needed. Plus, I wanted to get back on the road as soon as possible. "Yeah, sure," I said, pulling on my hat and gloves before stepping out into the freezing night. The moment I left the warmth of my car, the cold hit me like a slap. The wind was brutal, stinging my face and making my eyes water. My breath came out in thick, misty clouds as I hurried to the back of his car, eager to get this over with. "Let me grab my gloves," the man said, leaning into the front seat of his car. I waited, my arms wrapped around myself for warmth. The snow swirled around me, covering my boots as I stood there. The windows of his car were tinted dark, making it impossible to see inside. I shifted my weight from foot to foot, impatient. Then I heard something. A voice. It was quiet, almost drowned out by the wind. But it was there. Someone was talking inside the car. A second later, the man straightened up and turned back toward me. "Were you talking to me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. His expression flickered just for a moment. Then he smiled. "No, just talking to myself." But something felt off. His whole energy had changed. His smile did not reach his eyes anymore. Something in his posture, in the way he was looking at me, made my stomach twist. Then I noticed his eyes. They looked empty, hollow, like he was staring right through me. A wave of fear crawled up my spine. My body tensed, my instincts screaming at me to leave. And then I heard it, the sound of car doors opening, more than one. I turned my head just in time to see them. 3 more men stepping out of the car, moving fast, their dark silhouettes barely visible in the snow. Panic surged through me. I sprinted toward my car, slipping slightly on the icy road but catching myself just in time. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for the door handle. My car was still running, thank God. I threw myself into the driver's seat, slamming. The door shut just as I heard footsteps crunching behind me. I shoved the gear shift into drive and hit the gas. My tires spun for a second before catching traction, and I lurched forward. One of the men lunged toward my car, his hand smacking against the side window. I barely missed him as I swerved around the stuck vehicle, my car fishtailing slightly as I forced my way back onto the snowy road. My breath was ragged. My hands, were shaking as I gripped the wheel. My heart felt like it was going to explode out of my chest. I did not look back. I just kept driving. I did not stop until I reached the next town. My fingers were numb, my body still tense from the adrenaline. I pulled into a gas station parking lot and just sat there for a long moment, trying to catch my breath, trying to process what had just happened. I called the police and gave them all the details. The location, the description of the car, everything I could remember. They told me they would check it out, but I never heard anything else about it. No updates, no arrests, no news reports. As far as I know, those men left right after I did. I do not know what they wanted, but I have my guesses. And I know one thing for sure. If I had hesitated even a second longer, if I had stopped to ask just one more question, I might not have made it home that night. Winter roads in Norway can be brutal, especially when the snow starts falling faster than expected. I learned that the hard way. It was late January, and I was driving home from a trip to visit my family in Bergen. The journey was long, about 10 hours, but instead of stopping for the night somewhere, I decided to push through in one go. I figured if I stayed focused, took a few breaks, and drank enough coffee, I could make it home before midnight. For the first few hours, the drive was peaceful. The roads were mostly clear, and I had the comforting sound of my favorite playlist filling the car. But as I made my way further north, the weather started to change. At first, the snow was light, just a dusting that covered the trees and rooftops along the way. Nothing to worry about. But the further I drove, the heavier it got. Soon, thick snowflakes were swirling around, making it harder to see. By the time I was 3 hours from home, the storm was in full force. The road had become a slick, icy mess, and the visibility was getting worse by the minute. The headlights of my car barely cut through the snowfall, and the wind howled through the valleys. To make things even more unsettling, there were almost no other cars around. The long, empty stretch of road ahead of me was lined with dark, snow-covered trees, and the only sound was the rhythmic thud of my windshield wipers fighting against the snow. I kept driving, gripping the wheel tighter. I was determined to make it home that night. Then up ahead I saw something, a pair of flashing hazard lights, barely visible through the thick snowfall. As I got closer, I saw the car. It was positioned sideways in the road, blocking most of the clear path. A man stood next to it, waving his arms at me. Every instinct in me told me to keep driving. Something about the whole situation felt off. But I did not really have a choice. His car was in the way, and trying to squeeze past in these conditions could send me straight into a snowbank. I slowed down and pulled over carefully, keeping my engine running. Rolling my window down just enough to hear him, I saw the man hurry toward me. "My car is stuck," he said, his voice thick with a foreign accent. "Can you help push?" He sounded calm, but his words were slow, almost uncertain. I hesitated. His car was not buried deep in the snow. Just a little push might do the trick. And I wanted to get this over with quickly so I could be on my way. "Yeah, sure," I said, pulling on my gloves and hat before stepping out into the freezing night. The cold hit me instantly. The wind was brutal, stinging my face, and the snow swirled around my boots as I walked toward the back of his car. "I get gloves," the man said, leaning into the front seat of his car. I waited, shifting my weight to keep warm. The windows of his car were dark, and I could not see inside. Then over the howling wind, I heard something. A voice. It was quiet, but it was there. Someone was talking inside the car. A second later, the man straightened up and turned toward me. "Were you talking to me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. For just a second, his expression changed. His face went blank. Then, he forced a smile. "No, just talking to myself." he said. Something in his tone made my stomach twist. His whole demeanor felt different, now like the temperature had dropped even further. His smile did not reach his eyes. Then, I noticed his stare. His eyes looked empty, hollow, like there was nothing behind them. A wave of fear crawled up my spine. Then, I heard it. The sound of car doors opening. More than one. I turned just in time to see them, 3 more men stepping out of the car, moving fast. I did not think. I just ran. My boots slipped on the ice as I sprinted toward my car. My heart pounded, my breath coming out in heavy, panicked gasps. I could hear the crunch of footsteps behind me, but I did not dare look back. I yanked open my car door and threw myself into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut just as I saw movement in my side mirror. Thank God I had left the engine running. I jammed the gear into drive and hit the gas. My tires spun for a moment before gripping the road, and I surged forward, swerving around the stuck car. One of the men lunged toward me, his hand smacking against my side window, but I was already past them. My car fishtailed slightly on the icy road, but I kept going, hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I did not stop. Not until I reached the next town. I pulled into a gas station, my whole body still shaking. My breath was ragged, my heart felt like it was going to explode out of my chest. I called the police, gave them the details, the location, the car, the men. They said they would check it out. I never heard anything else about it, no arrests. No reports. As far as I know, those men left right after I did. I do not know what they wanted, but I have a pretty good guess, and I know one thing for sure. If I had hesitated even a second longer,